the first three questions would be directed to the writings, the religious, sacred writings. And the first question was, how is that literature classified? Ancient literature is divided into four: folk tale or folklore, two, legend, three, a myth, and four, historical. What is the meaning of these? Are there features that we can identify? A folk tale, there is no attempt to state a real or true story. So we have maybe the sun smiling on you and the breeze coming by and whispering a secret in your ear, or the birds and the animals all meeting as a big committee meeting. They know it's not at all true. The main intent is to be interesting and bring out a lesson or a moral. So in the question of a folk tale or a folklore, there is no real attempt to state a true story. When it comes to a legend, this is probably based on a real and true story. But changes slowly creep in. Exaggerations and embellishments to superhuman proportions. And when do these changes come in? They begin generations after the event, when there are no longer any eyewitnesses left to challenge your change. And the time period is usually centuries. The key really here is that a legend cannot be made in the same generation as the event or the story. Generations must pass before somebody adds and exaggerates. And why do we say time period as centuries? Here's an example. In relationship to the story of Gautama Buddha, there was a medallion that was carved by an artist, and this is what is said about that medallion. This medallion dates back certainly to the 2nd century BC. If we put the Buddha's nirvana or death during the 5th century, so the gap is 3 centuries, 300 years, then the artist who carved the medallion must have lived at a time when the memory of the Blessed One, that was Gautama Buddha, was still very fresh in the minds of the people. In other words, 300 years later, his story was still fresh. It takes centuries for real changes to creep in to form a legend. A myth is so far back in history that it is generally accepted as somebody's imagination. The story is probably not true. The characters are probably fictitious, and it usually involves the supernatural world. The time period here is many centuries and even millennia, thousands of years. When it comes to the historical, the attempt is to state a real, true story. There are no significant additions and no core changes over any period of time. Now, all ancient writings do have changes. There is not a single one that does not have some changes. The question really is, did those changes affect the main theme of the story, or were they only peripheral issues? And the closer to the event the writing is, the greater the credibility. On the screen you see certain letters, EV, OT, WT, and EM. EV is the event, and the dash is the time period between the event and OT, which is the oral tradition. Anytime any peculiar, unusual event took place, the community would make it into a story, and that is called the oral tradition. And they would pass it on from generation to the next, generation to generation. That is the oral tradition. Then after a few generations, somebody would think, oh, we might forget the real story. So he writes it down, and it becomes the written tradition now. And there's a gap between the event and the oral tradition, a gap between the oral tradition and the written tradition. And the fact now is that we do not have a single original manuscript. All we have are copies. So there's another gap between the original manuscript, which we have described as the written tradition, and the earliest manuscript, EM. If the gaps are wide, then the credibility of this historical piece of literature goes down. If the gaps are very close, the credibility goes up. With this description, let's see how the writings fare. Hinduism, the Rig Veda is probably the earliest writing of the Hindus, followed by the next three Veda texts, the Vedic texts, and then an anthology, the Upanishads, and then an epic or a large story called the Ramayana, in which Rama is the hero, and then another epic, the Mahabharata, in which is found the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna. Look at the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna first spoke Bhagavad Gita to the sun god some hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, that is really too far for any of us to go and check. And so it pushes this story towards the mythological. It was lost, the Bhagavad Gita, 100 million years ago. And then it came back to the human race about 3000 BC, at the beginning of the present age of the Hindus, which is Kali Yuga. But it still is 3000 BC, 5000 years ago. Once again, thousands of years unable to go and check for ourselves. And so we find that in a writing known, for example, called the Ultimate Encyclopedia of Mythology, we find these words: Krishna, according to Hindu mythology, is an avatar or an incarnate of Vishnu, the preserver of the universe. So most scholars accept the Hindu writings in these stories to be mythological accounts. Buddhism, I'm going to mention 4 statements in chronological order. The first one, the humanity of the Buddha is also expressed by a Theravada monk. A Theravada monk is one who lived during the time of Gautama Buddha. And he said, was he not born at Lumbini? Did he not complete existence at Kusinara? In other words, he was born here and he died here just like anybody else. Statement 2. Soon after the passing of the Master, a change began to set in. A change comes in. Statement number 3. At the beginning of the Christian era, the transcendental nature of the Buddha became more and more pronounced. In other words, 500 years later, we find some significant changes coming in. This transcendental nature. Now he is being lifted up from being an ordinary individual to somebody superhuman. The 4th statement is from the Mahayana literature, which is 700 to 1000 years later. There is not much of the man left in the Buddha. He is now an exalted being who has lived for countless ages in the past and will continue to live forever. Did you see the change? From the earliest writing of somebody who was contemporary with Buddha, who said he was born here, he died here just like anybody else. 700 years later, he has always lived in the past and will always live in the future. A change in a story. Therefore, it would be reasonable for us to say that the story of Gautama Buddha falls into the category of a legend. Judaism, the Torah, the law, the writings and the prophets are divided now into 39 books with so many different authors living at vastly different periods of history. Some writings to me appeared questionable in the sense of historicity, others were accurately historical. I didn't go into much detail at that point because I was hoping to put them into one classification. I could not. So I left the Judaic writing unclassified as to this point. There are other ways in which you can look at it, but for this moment I just left it unclassified. Islam, the Quran was put together in writing by 652 CE, Common Era, within 20 years of Muhammad's life. So just about the same generation. Only some changes in the text are accepted by scholars. I am being liberal in the sense that actually there were questions. There were variant readings during the Third Caliphate, which means the third ruler after Muhammad. And his name is Uthman, he ordered that it be consolidated into one with the help of some excellent scholars. So he called them and they made the present-day Quran. The unfortunate thing we find is that he ordered all the other manuscripts and readings destroyed. So in one sense, we cannot really go back to see what was there from which the present Quran has been brought together. However, it was within the lifetime or one generation of Muhammad, and therefore we have to acknowledge that it is most probably and should give it the classification of historical piece of literature. Christianity, the earliest manuscript we have, is dated about 114 to 134 AD in the John Rylands library in UK. The original manuscripts were written within 20 to 50 years of the life of Jesus. And this is the New Testament writings. The actual earliest writing, which can be classified as a Christian writing, is not in the Bible. It was found recently by a Jewish archaeologist. His name was Eliezer L. Sukenik. He was doing his archaeological digs at the same period as the 1st century AD, and he came across some tombs. And with the help of some coins next to the tombs, they dated those tombs to before AD 41, within 10 years of the life of Jesus. And on one tomb, was the word, Jesus is God. And on the second tomb, it appeared like a prayer to Jesus, the Ascended One. So the gap was from the event to the oral tradition to the written tradition, which was only 10 years, which really can be called no gap at all. And it was all confined to one generation, and today there are no real core changes in the story. We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. And that is Sir William Albright, who was one of the greatest archaeologists from America. Nelson Gluck, a Jewish archaeologist, has this to say about the Bible. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. That is saying a lot about a book that states that it wants to write down real history. Sir William Ramsay was another archaeologist, a British archaeologist, who was also doing his archaeological work at that same period of time. He had discarded the New Testament and was doing his digs when he came across some very perplexing situations, and he consulted one document after another. And finally, out of thinking that maybe the New Testament might help him, he went to Luke, the book of Acts. And there he found statements that cleared his perplexity. This happened over and over again. And over a period of 30 years, he found that Luke was stating some things that were accurate. And this is what he wrote about Luke. Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians, not religious historians, very greatest of historians. Norman Geisler, one of Christianity's apologists, says this: in all, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands without a single error. This is unusual when it comes to mythological and legendary stories. So with these features, we can recognize that the New Testament has very high credibility of being a historical piece of literature. So what I did next was compare that to other pieces that were written about the same time, which everyone knows is historical. Nobody controverts that. For example, Caesar's Gallic Wars. Herodotus' history, Tacitus' annals. You can go to any of the universities and the departments of history and get your MAs and your PhDs by quoting these authors. They are considered to be historical writings. But look at the gaps. Caesar's Gallic Wars was written in 100 BC, and the earliest manuscript we have is 900 AD, a gap of 1,000 years. In other words, for 1,000 years, so many generations, nobody can vouch that anything was added, deleted, changed. Similarly, Herodotus' history, 1,300 years. Tacitus' annals, 1,000 years. This is millennium, not just century. So if we are willing to accept these huge gaps and still retain the credibility of these writings, then why should we not accept this gap? If 1,000 years was okay, then 20 to 50 and even 10 years should be much better. In other words, when you look at historical pieces of literature, the gaps tell you the level of credibility. And look at this. The New Testament certainly is a very high credibility when it comes to the gaps. There are another two features we look at for historical credibility. And the second one is the number of manuscripts. You see, if there are just 4 or 5 manuscripts that back the writing, then one night you and I maybe might make a plan and go and change some parts in each of those 4 or 5 manuscripts. And in the morning, nobody would know that we have changed because it's changed in all of them. And we have corrupted the text. Whereas if there are 50 or 100 manuscripts spread out here and there and everywhere, it is difficult to go and change details in all of them. So if we find that the number of manuscripts is large, it raises the credibility. The lower the number of manuscripts, well, the more questionable, although it doesn't have to be. But it certainly is that one that has a high number of manuscripts is the more credible. So with that, let's look at these writings. Caesar's Gallic Wars is based on 10 manuscripts worldwide. Herodotus' history, 8 manuscripts worldwide. Tacitus' annals, 20 manuscripts worldwide. The one that has the highest number in Greek literature is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad is based on 643 manuscripts. Very impressive, right? Compared to the 8 and 20 and 10, 643 is amazing, impressive. What if I tell you that the New Testament is based on 664 manuscripts? Well, that would take the top spot, right? And like we said, when there's something impressive, we will have to say, wow, that's impressive. Do you know really how many manuscripts back the New Testament? It's not 664, it's 5,664. And that is Greek manuscripts. If you add the Armenian and the Arabic and the Latin and put them all together, the total number of manuscripts that back the New Testament is 24,900. So with these two features, gap, small. Number of manuscripts, by far the most. We will have to agree that we are leaning towards the idea that the New Testament is definitely historical in nature. How about the proximity of the authors? That's the third feature. Were the authors close by, or were they far removed from the event? Maybe by geography, maybe in another continent, another country, or in terms of generations, maybe removed from the event by ages. Look at these 3 statements in regards to the authors in the New Testament. Peter, who was one of the authors, writes, "We did not follow fables, but were eyewitnesses." And then John writes, "From that hour, that disciple took her to his home." Her is Mary, and that disciple is John himself. And number 3 is Luke, who writes the book of Acts. He said, when we sailed over the sea, we came to Myra. Did you notice what is happening here? These authors were not just close to the story, they were inside the story. They were part of the story. And you will have to agree with me, you cannot get any closer than inside. And so, these three features: close gaps, largest manuscript evidence, and the authors were not only close to the story, they were inside the story. In real terms, the New Testament is easily the best attested ancient writing in terms of the sheer number of documents, the time span between the events and the document, and the variety of documents available to sustain or contradict it. There is nothing in ancient manuscript evidence to match such textual availability and integrity. Said Sir Frederick Kenyon, no other ancient book has anything like such early and plentiful testimony to its text, and no unbiased scholar would deny that the text that has come down to us is substantially sound. How about this statement? In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings. Did you notice that it did not say among ancient religious prose writings? Among all ancient writings. From the Mayans to the Sumerians, to the Egyptians, to the Chaldeans, to the Babylonians, to the Chinese, to the Indians, to the Greek, to the Romans, you place them all on the table. And this little book called the New Testament will rise up as the best attested ancient piece of literature in the world. Amazing. It really is. In other words, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no document of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. In other words, friends, when you look at the features, the New Testament is solidly historical. In other words, it is not to be treated like a legend or a myth. Oh yes, we can question it. We can question any historical piece of literature, but we cannot question it as if it is legendary or mythological. In other words, when there are points that we need to question and we do not agree, then we do so on the level of historical argument. We don't just dismiss it because we feel it is mythological or legendary. No. We give a reason, a historical reason, if we want to discard anything. So, in short, the Quran and the New Testament are definitely historical in nature, with the New Testament having the highest credibility and integrity of text. The second question to the writings was, is there something inside the writing that would allow me to test the writing? After all, the writing was supposed to have come from way up there. I would find no way to get up there to test it. So is there something inside the writing which it says could be a test? That was my question. In Hinduism, they said we have to accept it as it is, otherwise there is no point in trying to understand the Bhagavad Gita and its speaker, Lord Krishna. In other words, there is no test inside the book. You have to take it or dismiss it, but no test. Similarly, in Buddhism, the genuine realization of emptiness of the phenomenon world is a direct intuition of the highest truth. Absolute truth is unconditional, undeterminate, and beyond thought and word. There's no way you can test it. But is there a test? Yes, they said there was a test, and the test was not in the writing, but in the experience of the person who was being involved. So the test was not in the writing, the test was how you would experience the teachings and the fundamental tenets of belief and the doctrines. Well, it seemed like a pretty good test. Except, this test was claimed by all the religions. So if every one of the religions claimed that to be a test, it could no longer be a test. If I said, turn at the tree with green leaves, how would that be a test and a sign? Every tree is green, has green leaves. So, when all of them say the same thing, it is no longer a test. When it comes to the Islamic challenge, here is one. In Surah 2, it says, produce one chapter comparable to it. Call upon your idols to assist you if what you say is true. But if you fail, as you are sure to fail. In other words, the Quran does throw out a test. Produce one chapter. In Surah 10 and 11, it says, produce a book like the Quran. Produce one verse like the Quran. So there was a test. I felt somewhat happy when I saw that. I said, okay, let's check this out. And the moment I went to check it out, there were 4 things that really destroyed my attempt. Number 1, it does not say what aspect to be equaled. So if you tell me that I must equal so and so, the first thing I will ask you, how shall I equal him? Shall I equal him in looks? Shall I equal him in his grades? Shall I equal him in his physical prowess? In his athleticism? What shall I equal? In his talents of music? What? So if you don't tell me what aspect to be equal, it really is not a test. Number 2, it doesn't describe the method of comparison. Will it be a subjective method? Or will it be objective? Maybe a point system? You get 20 and you get 25, well then you win. Or subjectively, I just feel this is better and I feel this is worse. What is the method of comparison? Does not describe it. Who will be the judge? It does not describe who will finally make the decision as to whether the writing is better, equal, or worse than the Quran. Will it be a mullah in one of the mosques? Or will it be maybe a neutral committee set up by the UN? I don't know. It doesn't say so. By default, if you don't state the judge, then the person who's doing the test will become the judge. Don't you think so? Yes. In that case, then if I am doing the test, I become the judge. If I am the judge, I can honestly say that I think there are other writings that can equal the Quran, at least equal. Arabic writings, Khalil Gibran, Omar Khayyam, Jalaluddin Rumi. I come from the state of Bengal in India that produced one of the Nobel laureates in literature. His name is Rabindranath Tagore. And sometimes when I've gone back to my state and I've heard my relatives reading the chaste writings of Bengali, which is the language, my jaws just drops open. It is just too beautiful. I cannot really and authentically state that anything is better than that. So if I am the judge, the test is over. Number 4 is one that really settles the matter. I have in my library an English translation of the Quran. An orthodox, regular, good Muslim will never consider my translation as the Quran, because the Quran can be the Holy Quran only in the Arabic language, because that is the only language of divine communication. So if I must equal the Quran, I must write in Arabic. Now, how many of us knows Arabic? I have so many Muslim friends. They don't know one line of literary Arabic. So we are all outside the test. Here it is, my friends. It's a hazy test. It does not say how to judge. It does not say who will be the judge. And it applies to only a narrow segment of the world's population, only those who know Arabic. Therefore, it is not a real test. Now we come to the Jewish writings and the Christian writings. I put them together for a specific reason, the Judeo-Christian challenge. But before we go into the challenge, I would like to read a statement made by a French scientist, a brilliant French scientist. His name was Pierre-Simon Laplace. When I was doing medical studies, we had to learn some of the laws of Laplace, although he was gone hundreds of years earlier, because he was brilliant. He had enunciated certain laws in science which we still studied. He was known as the Sir Isaac Newton of France. Isaac Newton was a Christian believer. Pierre-Simon Laplace was a complete unbeliever. He was an avowed atheist. He enunciated a concept known as scientific determinism. And I would like to read it out. Now, it's a long statement, but bear with me as I read it out, and I'll just tell you what he meant by it. Scientific determinism. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect, I don't know why he used the word intellect, but he did. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all the forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data for analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. This is what Pierre-Simon Laplace is saying. If there is an intellect that knows about every particle in the universe, that knows every feature of every particle in the universe, and also knows every law that governs every particle in the universe, then for that intellect, nothing would be uncertain. He could just look at what there is today and extrapolate backwards based on the laws and the features of the particles to something that happened 200 years ago and say, this is what happened, and he would be perfectly right. He could also take the conditions today, the information of today, and simply put it forward 100, 200 years later and say, that is what is going to happen, and he would be correct because he knows all the particles, all the laws of nature. Now, how do we know whether this is right or wrong? One way would be if this intellect came and sat here and said, I am the intellect. But we would not be able to test that intellect, because if I went to this intellect and tried to examine him, he might start speaking things that I don't know anything about. Then how will I test him? So there's no way to test the intellect if he just claims to be the intellect and we bring our test. But there is a possible way of checking this out, because this intellect seems to claim to know everything in the past and also everything in the future. So suppose I find this intellect making predictions before they occur, and every prediction seems to be coming right, is being fulfilled, then I might have identified an intellect that is described as being able to determine even what would happen in the future. This is exactly the test that the Judeo-Christian scriptures show. Present your case, says the Lord. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. This part of the Judeo-Christian scripture says that the intellect is called God. Pierre-Simon Laplace just used the word intellect. So they're talking about the same thing. Now, if we find a source from this God that makes predictions which consistently come to pass and are fulfilled as described in the prophecy, then we may have identified that intellect, and it would have to be an intellect that is supernatural. Here is one such prophecy. Jeremiah was a prophet. He claimed to be in touch with this supernatural entity. And in 51 chapter, 37th verse, it says, Babylon shall become a heap without an inhabitant. And in the previous verse, verse 36, he says, I will make her springs dry. When he wrote this, Babylon was at its zenith, the strongest and the most fortified city in the world. Do you know how broad the walls of Babylon were? No, we have walls today, 1.5 feet, 2 feet thick. Some big high-rise buildings, 5, 10 feet, the columns going up, maybe even 20 feet. Do you know how thick the walls of Babylon were? Archaeologists have gone and found certain places and they measured it up to 87 feet thick. Thick. Hard to batter down a wall that is that strong and big. How high would the walls of Babylon go? Most of the walls we see surrounding our buildings and the highways are 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 feet. Do you know how high the walls of Babylon went? Anywhere from 175 to 300 feet high. And if you had to climb over that wall, you would have to have a long, long ladder. But if you want to climb by a ladder, you'd have to bring the ladder close to the wall. You could not do that because Babylon was surrounded by a moat, and they say the moat was equal in volume to the wall itself. So how shall we win against a city like this? Well, it could be destroyed and made to surrender by laying siege. What is laying siege? Well, you bring your soldiers to the gates and don't let anybody go in and out because the food supply is outside. The farmland is outside. So if you do it for a considerable period of time, no more food will come in. And the people inside will starve. And in that starved state, they will come out and surrender. That is laying a siege. Well, if you lay a siege, you have to just pay your soldiers. So you have to be a rather rich king or an emperor or a general to do that. Because soldiers usually, when they go to war in those days, the way they got their pay was by the booty that they won. When there's no war, you're just looking at the gate, staring at it, you're not going to get any booty. So, the way to lay a siege is to simply pay your soldiers month after month. And so you have to be rich. You have to be willing to pay. And so sieges don't last very, very long. 8, 9, 10 months, 1 year, 1.5, maximum 2.5 to 3 years. After that, you give up. You know, the people in Babylon would laugh at anyone who was planning to lay siege because in the storehouses of Babylon, there was enough food for all the inhabitants for a period of 20 years. Now, how are you going to win against this kind of a city? Well, it was overthrown by Cyrus the Medo-Persian. And these are some traditional writings about how it was done. You know, Cyrus came around looking to see if he could get Babylon because he was winning all the wars. Babylon seemed to be the block to him becoming world emperor. He wanted Babylon, that big, powerful city. So he went scouting around to see how he could win, how he could get inside there. In one of his scouting trips, his horse is supposed to have died in the river Euphrates. Now, the river Euphrates was the water supply for Babylon. It went on one end of the city and came out the other end. He was so angry with the river for killing his horse that he called his generals and he said, I want this river dry. So the generals and the soldiers got together and they said, he wants it dry, so got to do it. And the traditional writings say that they dug 80 to 300 small canals or aqueducts paralleling the river Euphrates, and they drained that river dry. The moment the river was drained, Cyrus saw his way into the city on the riverbed under the wall, and Babylon fell in one night. One night, without a single drop of bloodshed. The moment he came in, the inhabitants of Babylon just embraced him. Later on, Babylon fell into ruin. And today, few words evoke as many images of ancient decadence, glory, and prophetic doom as does Babylon. And yet the actual place, 50 miles south of Baghdad, is flat, hot, what's the next word? Deserted, dusty. What was the prophecy? That Babylon would not be inhabited. Friends, you do not have to be a believer. All you have to do is gather maybe a little bit money and get a plane ticket and go to Baghdad. And you can see that this prophecy, with your own eyes you can see that this prophecy has been fulfilled. 2,500 years later, it is still not inhabited. How about that second verse, which is actually the previous verse? How did Babylon fall? When it was written, Jeremiah the prophet wrote, I will make her springs dry. It was the river Euphrates that was dried, and that is how Babylon fell. Amazing. A prophecy that came to pass. There are more. I'll just mention a few. The place of Jesus' birth was mentioned. In Micah 5:2 it says Bethlehem. And we know from the writings of the New Testament it was in Bethlehem that he was born. Now in Judea, in the Palestinian area, there were two Bethlehems. One was close to Nazareth, where he lived, and one was further away. Bethlehem was the Bethlehem that was prophesied, was the one that was further away. And the reason that the parents of Jesus went to Bethlehem was because a foreign king had ordered a census of the people. And they said, go back to your ancestral home. And the parents of Jesus went to the ancestral home. This prophecy was written 500 years before the birth. And in those 500 years, the couple went for exactly those few days or weeks when she was ready to give birth, gave birth, came back to Nazareth and never went back to Bethlehem. But the prophecy said he'll be born in Bethlehem. How about what you give for somebody who is thirsty? Water, drink, fruit juice, milk. But this was a prophecy written 1,000 years earlier, and it says, for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. And we know it was earlier because the Dead Sea Scrolls were dated at least 150 BC. And look what is written about the time when Jesus was crucified. He said, I thirst. They filled a sponge with sour wine, which is the same as vinegar, and put it to his mouth. The prophecy clearly came true. Now, how many prophecies would you like so that you can say, well, we may have identified the intellect of Pere Simon Laplace? I would say 5, 10, 15 would be enough. Now, I haven't counted the number of prophecies. But these scholars, they go doing counting sometimes, and they do minute counting. And they go to every little bit. And they tell me that there are over 600 prophecies in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. 322 are about a single individual. 23 to 25 came to pass in one weekend. Talk about something being amazing. If this is the picture that is shown in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, my friends, we, I believe, have identified the intellect that Pere Simon Laplace was talking about. And that intellect, therefore, knows every particle in the universe. Therefore, that intellect must be supernatural. So this is a test that only the Judeo-Christian scriptures has given, a test called predictive prophecy. Look at these two statements. One by Pere Simon Laplace, who is an avowed atheist, and another by a prolific writer in the United States. Her name is Ellen G. White. And look at the highlighted words and how they are nearly the same. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain. The future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. And Ellen G. White states that he that ruleth in the heavens is identified with that intellect, because all the other highlighted words are the same. Can you imagine? A complete atheist, agreeing with a respected believer. In some circles, she is even accepted as a prophetess. So, if there are multiple sources which have concurring data, we must give it the credence and the credibility that it deserves. Because this is from a brilliant atheistic scientist agreeing with a respected believer whom some people even call a prophetess. And it's written in ancient sacred writing, we know it's there. And also, whatever is written there can be verified in secular history. And some of those things we can verify today. Therefore, the Judeo-Christian book, when we look at it, especially with the New Testament, it is the best attested historical literature, least gaps in time, in fact, no gaps, the greatest manuscript evidence, the authors were part of the story, and it is the only writing that permits an open test for possible divine origin. It is truly an amazing piece of information that we are facing in this test. The third feature that I looked at was the question of bringing out a top feature. What is the top feature of your writing? Now, there is really no top feature as such. I had to look for some and pull them out. But they are considered to be some of the top features. So let's look at them. In Islam, the top feature is considered to be the language of the Quran, the rhetor, the diction, the rhythm, the prose, beautiful. When they listen to it, they feel enveloped in a divine dimension of sound. It's not just words. And if you see a Muslim reading the Quran, he would never just read it cross-legged and, in a relaxed manner in that sense. They always read it with a bowing forward, moving, because there's a rhythm to the Quran. It is beautiful in its rhythm. Let me tell you one incident. During the time of Muhammad, Al-Khattab was very upset that Muhammad was bringing what he called a heresy. Because in the Arabian Peninsula, they had many deities. And Muhammad was coming with a totally new message, a heretical message. There's only one God, Allah. And he was so angry one day that he decided he would take the life of Muhammad. So he put his sword in its sheath, wrapped it around his waist and said, I'm going to find Muhammad and kill him today. On the way to Muhammad's place, somebody stopped him and said, you're going to Muhammad, maybe it's better for you to go and look what's happening in your own house. He knew what was happening, or he guessed. He raced back home. And when he threw open the door of his own house, there he finds the local blacksmith reading from the Quran to his own sister. He was so upset. He went and whacked her on the face, a real blow. Sent her sprawling on the ground, blood coming out of her face. They all got up and ran. And then he stood there, a little remorseful. He knew he shouldn't have done such a nasty thing as beat up his own sister. And then he saw the Quran on the ground. And he went and picked it up. It was open to Surah 20, chapter 20. And he read chapter 20. And he said these words, how fine and noble is this speech, he said wonderingly. And this Muslim was felled or brought to his knees by the beauty of the Quran, which reached through his passionate hatred and prejudice to an inner receptivity that he had not been aware of. You know what he did? He put the sword back in its sheath, walked down the street to where Muhammad was, knelt before him, and he said, from now I am a Muslim, converted in 1 hour just by reading the Quran. Wow. Amazed? Of course we should be. There's something there that really can envelop and grip a person. And in the Quran, Muhammad is often called the Ummi prophet, the unlettered prophet. Why? Because it is said that Muhammad was illiterate. He could neither read nor write. Imagine, person who cannot read or write, bringing such wonderful prose that it can convert a determined enemy in 1 hour. The language of the Quran then is amazing, exquisitely beautiful, and possibly supernatural. Hinduism, it's deep philosophy. The National Geographic says this: Hindu sages gave to mankind one of the most sophisticated systems of philosophy ever devised. It's a blend of religion, ethics, civil codes, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and other natural sciences. Let me tell you just one little bit of information that you get from there. In relationship to the periods of time, there is something in the writing known as kalpa. A kalpa is one segment of time. It is 4.2 billion years, one kalpa. At the other end of the spectrum are kashta. A kashta is a small period. Do you know how small it is? 300 millionth of a second. And this is written in literature thousands of years old. How did they measure 100 millionths of a second? I don't know. The only thing we have today that can correspond to these kind of time periods are the radioisotope half-lives. Like I had mentioned earlier, the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.53 billion years. And the half-lives of bosons and the fermions, they are 100 millionth of a second. Amazing, this information being there. And so when you blend it into all that they are saying of mathematics and medicine and civics and everything else, Hindu philosophy will be acknowledged as amazing, deep, and brilliant, and possibly supernatural. Buddhism, there are three features. It's vast, detailed, and mysterious. The Pali canon, Pali is a language, fills 45 huge volumes. The Chinese scriptures consist of 100 volumes of 1,000 closely printed pages each, while the Tibetan extends to 325 volumes. So the Indian, Chinese, and the Tibetan Buddhist writings, if you put them together, total about 470,000 pages. Can you imagine the vastness of it? And despite the vastness, there is a great deal of detail. For example, this is how you identify the Lord Gautama Buddha's body, or any Buddha's body. The Lord's body had 32 marks of a Superman and was adorned with the 80 subsidiary characteristics. He was endowed with the 18 special dharmas of a Buddha, mighty with the 10 powers of a Tathagata, and in possession of the 4 grounds of self-confidence. See how detailed, absolutely detailed. The monks were subject to 250 rules known as Pratimoksha rules. And they had a prayer for forgiveness which ran something like this, and which they had to repeat morning and evening. May I be freed at all times from the 4 states of woe, the 3 scourges, the 8 wrong circumstances, the 5 enemies, the 4 deficiencies, the 5 misfortunes, and quickly attain the path. And you don't just say 3 scourges, you mention the 3, and so you have to go through all of them in detail. So it's vast, detailed, as well as mysterious. The bulk of this literature is couched in a deliberately mysterious language which would convey nothing to the average reader. Here's one statement: the realization that undifferentiated emptiness is the sole absolute truth. Nirvana is therefore that mental state in which one realizes that all things are really non-existent. It's extremely difficult to really use logic or reason when you read these kind of statements. So it is mysterious. Buddhism then has amazing, awesome, mysterious, possibly supernatural. I've put the Judeo-Christian again because of this feature, the writing. It contains writings from quite a few types of authors. The spectrum of authors defies any coherent classification. Kings, military generals, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, tax collectors, poets, musicians, statesmen, scholars, shepherds, farmers. But the point really of the feature that I am trying to present is this: there are attesting cross-references between authors. Say of the Old Testament, for example, Daniel says, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet. What's he saying? He was moved to write by a source that he called the Lord. And he's attesting that the same Lord also spoke to Jeremiah decades ago. So the source was both for Daniel and Jeremiah. The similar picture is found in the New Testament. Like Peter writes, as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, has written to you. So where did Paul get his wisdom? From a certain place called the Lord. And Peter states that all he had ever written also came from the Lord. And then between authors of the New and the Old Testament, for example, Matthew writes, so all this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. In other words, Matthew is saying, I got my info and the information from the Lord, and the same Lord gave information that Isaiah had 600 years earlier. Do you know there's no cross-referencing in any other literature? This is the only literature that has cross-references. And it is clear that they're referring and giving all their admiration to the Lord. That gets all the credit. So the Lord then, if we take their words as truth and we have no way to controvert them, then this Lord was the source throughout the writing of the Bible. Then this Lord lived for at least 14 to 1500 years, and that we have to question whether it's humanly possible at all. And so we say it is possibly supernatural. So when you consider the top features, all the top features are amazing and highly impressive, and they all get excellent marks. So we've got 3 questions that we looked at today. What type of writing? And we found that the New Testament is the best attested historical piece of writing. Do any of the literature throw out a test to challenge to test it? Only the Judeo-Christian scriptures state a challenge that anyone can do, whether you're a believer or not. And as the top feature, all of them are really amazing and impressive. With these words, we will close now, and we will continue with the next 7, which refer to the flesh and blood founders. The next 7 questions to the flesh and blood founders.